I'm Bobby Wrinkle. I want to welcome you to Evening Upstairs at your library. Referred to as Castle on the Cumberland, this imposing structure has served as both a beginning and an end for some of the state's most notorious criminals. Tonight's presenter will take you behind locked doors, sharing stories of murders, riots, escapes that have made this prison a place of mystery and intrigue for over 100 years. Our speaker earned his bachelor's degree from Murray State and his JD from UK. He's a veteran of the U.S. Army, having served in Vietnam, Korea, and Germany. And before becoming a member of the Kentucky's highest court in 2006, he served as a circuit court judge for 15 years. He has authored several popular books on regional history, and his articles and blogs have helped to inform the public about the legal system, as well as the state's rich history. Let's welcome our guest, Kentucky's Supreme Court Justice, Bill Cunningham.
Thank you, Bobby. Thank you. Wow. Thank you, Bobby. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is so flattering to see such a huge crowd. I know you came out for the drawing, so you haven't got me fooled. Wow, this is really impressive. I thank you for coming. I know you're really coming for the topic. I mean, this is a fascinating topic we're going to talk about tonight. I'll tell you what Elizabeth Taylor told each of her husbands. I won't keep you long. Paula told me that's getting a little dated, so half the people don't even remember who Elizabeth Taylor was, Dwayne, so I guess I wanted to change that around. You got any suggestions for the replacement?
Henry VIII.
Okay, Henry VIII. The rest of these, Matt's informed me that they got this cutoff thing back there, that we're on TV, or we'll be on TV, and we're on a timer here, so if I wrap it up like I'm signing off the night show, you don't have to leave right then. We're just cutting off, so they leave us, and we may be answering some questions. Who knows? Maybe we'll be all out of here by now. We're here to talk about, and I'll make claim to this, the most interesting, violent, romantic, fascinating 10.5 acres of real estate in the state of Kentucky. It's located right up the river, right up here in Lyon County. We're going to talk about it tonight. I am honored this evening, and we should all feel honored. We got the man in charge of the castle. The warden, Randy White, is with us tonight with his lovely two girls, his wife, Susan, and his daughter, Lauren. Randy, won't you stand, please? If you read the castle and you read and you meet and you talk with Randy, you're going to see there's been quite an intellectual and cultural spread between the first warden of the penitentiary in 1884 to today, especially when you read some of these journal entries. We're here, the good crowd's here to talk about this interesting topic. I never know when I come to these meetings how much I can assume that you know about the subject matter. We were driving down here back last winter, I guess, when we came down to talk about the night riders right here. We were driving down here, my wife Paula, I'll embarrass her again, I don't know where she is, but she's here somewhere. She said, "You're not going to go tell them the whole story again tonight, are you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, you going to tell them the whole story about the night riders?" And I said, "Well, they want me to come down and talk about the night riders. I guess I'll tell them the whole story." So we never know how much to assume. How much you've read the book, how much you know about the penitentiary. Some people may have just been walking in to get out of the rain, don't even know what we're talking about. We can assume too much, however. It's quite a balance there. Joe Creason told a story about a guy that was thinking he was maybe assuming too much years ago. There was this mountaineer up in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. His wife had about 12 kids. Apparently he didn't know where kids came from because he was complaining to his friend one day, said, "I can't feed any more mouths. My wife gets pregnant with one more child. I'm going to go out here on the mountain and I'm going to hang myself." Well, the friend didn't believe him until he noticed that his friend wasn't in town on a couple of Saturdays, and then he learned that this friend's wife was expecting again. And he really got concerned. He thought, well, maybe Billy Joe did do it. Maybe he went out and committed suicide, and he got really concerned. And then the following Saturday, Billy Joe shows up in town. His friend goes running up to him and embraces him. "Billy Joe, I was so worried about you." "Why were you worried about me?" "Well, you know, you told me that if your wife, if Betty Lou, got pregnant again, you're going to go out and hang yourself. And I heard that she was. I didn't see her for several Saturdays. I really got worried. Billy Joe said, well, you know, I thought seriously about it. In fact, he said, I actually got on my old mule cake, and I went on the side of the mountain, and I got me a good strong rope, and I tied a noose, and I put it around my neck, I threw it over the limb, and I was about ready to kill myself. But I started thinking, I may be hanging an innocent man. So we can't assume too much. Can't assume too much. I tried to look at this like I would do when I go see somebody who's written a book. I'm going to try to touch on a few things that I'm going to talk about the book. What I like to hear about a lot when I'm talking to somebody who's written a book that I've read. How did this book come about? What are some things that didn't come into the book? What are some of the background information? What are some of the things that influenced you? What did you find out about this? We'll try to hit on some of that. I'll say first of all that this topic, this subject matter, is very personal. It's very personal. I came within 200 yards of being born in the Kentucky State Penitentiary. I was born right across the street from it. And on a government reservation. I told my wife that when I first met, and she wouldn't know what tribe I belonged to. I belong to the Corps of Engineers tribe. We lived in an old lock house I was born in, and grew up across the street in the penitentiary, and started going in the prison at a very early age. One of the media outlets called me a week or so ago, and one of the questions was, when did you first become fascinated with the Kentucky State Penitentiary? And I said, well, I don't know if fascination is the right word. If you go by, and I hope everybody has at some time or another, if you haven't really lived in West Kentucky very long, you drive by the penitentiary, you go by it in a boat, you're fascinated by it. You're just flat fascinated. If you grow up next to it, in and out of it from an early age, there's intimacy about it. That it's kind of like having a eccentric and interesting old uncle. You just grow up with it. And yes, fascination may be part of it, but it's more of an intimacy more than anything else. The prison, just to hit upon a few of the high marks of its history, came about. There's a great Confederate connection with this penitentiary. Two individuals, Governor Luke P. Blackman, who was a Confederate veteran. He was a hero of the Confederate War. Professor Bolin, you will recall that he was a doctor in New Orleans during the bubonic plague, or one of the plagues down there, and he, at great risk to his own life, he serviced those people. Came back to Kentucky, as many of the Confederate veterans did at that time, got into politics, very popular, and got elected governor. Well, the governor's mansion at that time is now what they call the old governor's mansion in Frankfort. It was right across the street from the old Frankfort prison, and conditions there were really dismal, really bad. The inmates were dying from filth, they were dying from malaria, they were dying from all kinds of disease. The sanitation situations were terrible. The wardens were corrupt, they were selling the services of the inmates. And Luke Blackburn was able to look across the street and see them carrying inmates out there on a daily basis who had died during the night. So he said, we're going to do something about this. His compassion as a medical doctor, also his position as governor, he said, we're going to do something about this. We need another penitentiary. So he went to work on getting what they called a branch penitentiary. They were looking for a branch penitentiary. Frankfort would still keep its prison, but they would go out in the state and build a branch penitentiary. And he appointed a commission. And one of the three members of that commission was Highland B. Lyon, General Highland B. Lyon of Lyon County. He had a lot of influence. He's quite a history as a military leader during the Civil War. If you go throughout West Kentucky, you'll see in many of these small towns, county seats, the historical markers. This is one of the courthouses that his boys burned, keep them out of Union hands. That was Highland B. Lyon. Well, him and Blackburn were great political allies, and so was William Stone, who was a state senator from Lyon County. And Lyon and Stone decided, we want the prison here. We want it here in Eddyville. So there was some competition for it because it was an industry, as it still is today. So there was a competition for it, and it came down, the two cities that were vying for it was Bowling Green and Eddyville. Well, Highland Beeline made the call on that. With his influence with Luke Blackburn and Eddyville, got the penitentiary. That was in 1879 when Blackburn was elected, and so the money was appropriated. At first, the legislature does like it always does, Randy. When it comes to corrections, they just want to leave it over here. Throw as little money to it as they can. We want to use our money on voters. And they didn't. We were reluctant at first to fund a new prison, but then he started pardoning prisoners pretty frequently. Said, I got another way I can handle this. You're not going to build us a new prison? I'll just let the prisoners out. So he finally got their attention. They appropriated the money, and they began the construction of Kentucky State Penitentiary in October 1884. The first blast for the quarry out there outside of Eddyville for this massive stone that would be used took place, and the construction began. And it began over the next 3 or 4 years. In my book, there's a little bit of inconsistencies and a little bit of confusion that I recognize when looking back over it. We had the first inmates moving into the penitentiary Christmas Eve, 1889. But if you look at the journal pieces that have been entered by the first warden, Lewis Curry, they are in 1888. Well, the reason for that confusion is that the Kentucky State Penitentiary became a prison almost in the day construction began, because they brought in inmates to help the construction. They set up shops. They set up housing for them. So inmates were on the scene almost for the beginning. So it's kind of hard to nail down a date when actually the Kentucky State Penitentiary opened for business. It was pretty much open for business from day one. And if you read Warden Curry's journal entries in 1888, you can tell if you read those, they had cells there by that time. They had a whipping stone there by that time. So they were pretty much in business early on, once the walls started going up and once it started taking shape. So the prisoners were down there pretty much from the beginning. The Christmas Eve 1889 was maybe when they brought the rest of the inmate population to fill up the rest of the cells, and it was on that date. It cost $275,000 to build that prison. They probably spend that much a month today, Randy, on the upkeep and maintenance. About 87 acres. You go down there, you see the prison walls encompass about 10.5 acres. But we own a lot more. All the back out there goes up into the woods. You see the rifle range out there and on up to where the old prison dump was when I was growing up. And now even up there, we have discovered and had dedicated about a year ago, we uncovered Old Vinegar Hill, where many, many years ago they buried pauper inmates. They used 30 stonemasons for the construction of the penitentiary. And I think the architecture of it is something that's just amazing, and it's what catches everybody's attention. They did a great job in building the prison. When they first moved into the prison, unfortunately, it wasn't a whole lot better as the Frankfort prison. In fact, the mortality rate was about as high. In 1887, in 1896, 33 inmates died from natural causes. In 1897, 27 died from natural causes. And I say natural causes, the main cause of death was the sewer gas. They had no adequate sanitation. They had toilet buckets they kept in their cells. They put long-term prisoners down in the basement, the bottom of those cell houses, and the sewer gas became lethal, and it killed a lot of inmates. And the mortality rate everywhere during those years was rough, but it was a tough time. And you read about those early days, the mortality rate was high. In 1911, the electric chair went in, and that added a new dimension to the penitentiary and added so much drama that we have today. Anyway, those were the early days of the penitentiary. I want to talk a little bit about my own association with it and talk about some of that perspective. I grew up right across the street in the penitentiary. I went into prison when I was a little boy as a bat boy for a local baseball team, and I got to know the inmates pretty well. At that time, the trustees, as they called them, worked on the outside, and we still have minimum security prisoners. What, about 20, 25, Randy?
We try to keep 30.
Yeah, about 30. They live in a separate dorm, though, and the dorm's outside, and they're minimum security. They never go in and out of the penitentiary. Back when I was growing up, they worked outside, and they lived inside the penitentiary, so went in and out all the time. They had inmates that kept maintained the outside premises like you do today. You had houseboys that worked at the wardens and the deputy wardens' houses. It wasn't uncommon to see the cook for the warden dressed in starch whites downtown at the grocery store, shopping like every other person who was needing groceries. So it's kind of integrated with the town of Old Eddyville. At that time, before the lake was built, the penitentiary, of course, is right where it is today, but it was right in the middle of town. Right smack in the middle of Old Eddyville. So it was integrated in with that town. So went in and out of there. My dad asked the warden one time, Chuck Thomas, said, is it Bill in any danger going in there as a small boy? And this gives you a good indication of the inmate mentality at that time. I don't think it's the same today. Chuck told my father, he said, Allman, Bill is safer in that penitentiary with these inmates than he'd be anywhere else. He said, if anybody harmed a hair on that boy's head, he'd be dead in 30 seconds. There's two things that those inmates love to have come inside the prison for visits, were children and women. And they're very protective of it. And so, yep, I went in there, got to know some of the inmates. They would latch on to you when you go in there as a small boy, 12, 13 years old, as a bat boy. You couldn't really act as a bat boy because they all wanted to talk to you. And they bring you things. They bring you gifts. They give you things. They were so happy to have you. I had a special gift that was given to me one time. This inmate was talking to me. He talked to me the whole game about his family, about his children. He disappeared for a little while, and he came back, and he had this wallet that he had made out of cigarette packages. It was very clever. He had the red Pall Mall cigarettes in squares sold for the outside. He had the silver linings for inside where the paper money place was. He even had plastic containers for the picture. He gave it to me as a gift. I kept that for a long, long time, all the way up until I came back practicing law in Eddyville and lost it. I don't know what happened to it, but anyway, they would really cater to children coming to the penitentiary. I got to know them in that capacity. There were two, three things that really had an impact on us young boys, and I guess young girls. We never saw young girls. I know, what do you young girls do in the summertime? We'd see you at school, and that'd be about it. But two things that really impacted us was the river that ran behind our house and the prison that was in front of our house. And with the prison, it was that dichotomy of good and evil. We'd have inmates that were trustees that came out of the prison. They sold billfolds and wallets at the leather shop, and they'd slip us a baseball that they'd stolen from inside the baseball team. We'd sit and talk with them. One of them named Pi Keem, silver-haired old inmate, ran the shop out there where they sold leather goods. Had an FM radio hooked up, and he was a big St. Louis Cardinal fan. And we sat away there sometimes, while away the summer afternoon with Pi King listening to Cardinal games. So we realized, and people say, the word would get around, what's this guy do? He murdered somebody. You start hearing some of the things he did. He doesn't seem like such a bad guy. So you learn pretty early, just like correctional officers do. They were all Jekyll and Hyde. And there's goodness in them when you take them away from certain environment, certain influences, certain addictions, and there's also a lot of evil in them. Sometimes, even when you take them around, it takes place there in the penitentiary. Later on, the lake came, we moved. I came back out of the Army, and I was looking for a job, had a pregnant wife. I'll take anything. So the public defender, Marvin Prince, called me up one day and said, Billy, you're pretty familiar with that prison, aren't you? I said, yeah. How would you like to be public defender for the inmates penitentiary? It scares all of my guys away. You can do that, can't you? I said, sure. So my first job was, as a lawyer after getting out of the Army, was public defender for inmates at the penitentiary. Boy, I was glad to get it. And it was boot camp for a defense lawyer, because in those days, the classification is not as good as it is today, and you had all kinds of prisoners in there that would charge for everything from murder to contraband, and some of the contraband really wasn't that serious. But I got to know the inmates better on an adult basis then as public defender. I learned some tricks of the trade, and began to learn more and more about the inmate code that they have, and they did have an inmate code. And there was something charismatic about some of them. Years later, when I was Commonwealth attorney, we set up a Scared Straight program where you would bring young offenders in. You've probably seen it on TV. They go through, see all the bad things, and then they would have prisoners to come out. We did that Scared Straight as Commonwealth attorney, but my insight into inmates excluded one thing. I said, no, I don't want them talking to inmates. Because some of these guys, and Randy knows this, are pretty charismatic. They're pretty impressive. You get some of these young kids, they're on the border, they're coming from a bad neighborhood, they're very influential, they're going to say, this guy's pretty cool. Maybe I ought to be like him. Because some of them were pretty charismatic, and still are today. Some of them very smart, most of them not very smart, or they wouldn't be there. And some of them can offer some very interesting insights. I remember an old inmate I was talking to one day, and I think he was a witness in a case. And I remember when I was public defender or Commonwealth attorney. After we were through, we just sat there and talked. They're interesting people. I mean, it's a life. You listen to these guys, things they've done, things they've seen. So he got up to leave, and he said, Bill, I'm not guilty of what I'm serving time for in here. Well, you hear that a lot, of course, which I didn't pay much attention to it until he said, but you know what? I've done so much in my life and got away with it. Who am I to complain? I like that guy. What do you not like about that guy? He thought all evens out. I just go take my medicine because I missed it for the little thing. Yeah, they're an interesting being. And then as Commonwealth attorney, of course, prosecuted them. And then as circuit judge, we had a courtroom there, still do, in the penitentiary. Judge Ed Johnstone, who were trying to get the McCracken County Federal Courthouse named in honor of, by the way. We can't get our U.S. Senator to do it. So if you know either one of our U.S. Senators and you knew Ed Johnstone, it needs to be named for him. He's a great man. He set up the prison courtroom when he was circuit judge, and we went down there for that. And later on, when I was circuit judge, we had to conduct court, and they still do, first Friday morning of each month. Handle all non-jury matters in that courtroom. I always treated inmates with tremendous respect. It's amazing to some of my fellow justices that Randy White and I and every prison warden I've known in the last 50 years are able to walk that yard and talk to people. Some of my best friends in there are people I prosecuted. We're going to talk about him in just a minute. Prosecuted and sentenced, because I always treat them with respect. We always had a mutual respect. And that grew, I think, from my childhood, recognizing these people are human beings. And you treat them with respect. You make them think you're doing your duty. There's a mutual respect. They respect people that do it with duty. Sometimes we would have a few problems down there. Mark Twain said that you can read all you want to about a cat. You can study about a cat. You can look at pictures of a cat. But the only way you get to know a cat is pick one up by its tail. I would say the only way you get to know an inmate is have one come over to the bench at you and land in your lap, which I had one time. Uriah Pasha, and we got it all on videotape. And if you're in corrections and all that, they use it as a training film for courtroom security. I guess what you shouldn't do. I'll tell you one little thing about that assault, which is indicative and is very illustrative of how you have to be on your toes in this maximum security prison all the time. All the time. You never forget where you are. That courtroom has a bench like this, much wider, a regular bench, but it's portable like this, and it sits on a platform about that high. so that when they want to use that room for parole board hearings that they did at that time, they can move it all around. But it's a courtroom with a bench, but it's you can take it apart and move it around. Well, over time, this throughout here, the front of it was supposed to be flush with that platform. And when it was, you were sitting up pretty high. On the particular morning, Uriah Pasha came over the bench after me. Over time, it had slipped back. Slowly slipped back. About that much of a ledge was right down here between the edge of the platform and the bench. That's where he got his foot. He got his foot on that ledge, and over he came. Had that little space not been there, he had never got over the bench. It's just constant surveillance at the penitentiary. That's why I have so much admiration for the people who work there and have been championing their cause all my life, actually. Talk about the book a little bit, some insights on this. When this book first came out, we took it to the book fair in Frankfurt, and Bobby's been there. If you ever get a chance to go to the book fair in Frankfurt, it's a great place. You can get books at 20% discount. A lot of times they have noted authors, get them autographed. It's some 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, you buy your Christmas gifts there. We took this book up there, and it sold really good, did really good. And Carl West, editor of the Frankfurt paper at that time, was talking to Paula about it, and he said, really enjoyed Bill's book. Castle said he took a lot of literary license with that book, didn't he? She said, what do you mean? He said, well, how do you know what that inmate did when Don Tate was out there running around in the woods in between the rivers, and what he thought and what he did and where he went those 2 or 3 nights? He said, well, he knew Don Tate. He did? He said, yeah. Well, in fact, everything that's written in this book is information I took from newspapers or from primary sources. Yeah, I knew Don Tate. He was an inmate. I prosecuted him. One of the most incredible escapes ever out of that penitentiary. And Leadership Kentucky is going to go in there next week. Let them show you what Don Tate, when you get on the yard with Randy White, let him show you what Don Tate did. He was 50 years old. I'm not sure the Olympians could do what he did. Came out of his cell, down the yard, up the top, over the top. Incredible. But anyway, he got out. Long meandering trail over the land between the rivers. You read the book, I won't go into that. Kind of an incredible story. He wandered around over between the land between the lakes 3 days, thinking he was almost Tennessee, and he walked up on a ridge one day and looked out, and he was across the lake from the penitentiary. He said, Bill, I lost it. He said, I was desperate. He said, and then I saw this old man in a fishing boat right down in front of me. He said, I couldn't resist. He said, I wanted that fishing boat. He said, about the time I saw it, the old man saw me. He went out into the water, I went into the water. And it turns out we were only about water a waist deep. He was wading away from the boat, I was wading to the boat. He got in that boat, cranked that motor, headed for Tennessee. How did I know all that? Because Don told me about it. He told me about it. And in fact, it was such an incredible story, he wrote a screenplay about it. And we were getting ready, Hollywood was interested in it. Had a producer to call me and said, we want to know if you can get clearance for us to come in there and film some of this. And I said, I think so. I called the warden then, I think it was Bill Sebo. Bill said, fine, just let us know, we'll set it up. And then something kind of wayward happened. Don was out by that time on parole, and he got in trouble when his wife ended up being murdered. And they picked him up. I don't know whatever happened to that, but that all went down the tube. But I knew all that because Don Tate had not only told me about it, but written about it as well. All these stories in here I got from newspaper or primary sources. Keeping in mind now, I've known every single warden at that penitentiary in the last 50 years. Many of them, like the one here tonight, have been close personal friends. I go down and visit, go down and hang out. My wife and my secretary both think I'm a little bit weird, go hanging out at the prison. But you go down there, and it's an interesting place to be. Plus, I think some of it is, it's about the only thing left in my old hometown is that prison and a few houses. Stony Parker, The guard who blasted the guys off the top of the water tank with a little buckshot. I knew Stoney Parker. He told me that story. In fact, Stoney wanted to tell you that story about every time he saw you. He thought he was great. These for a while, and I think they got it barricaded off now. There's a water tank on the yard, and inmates get bored. They'd just go up on the water tank. They'd go scampering up that water tank. Wouldn't come down. They'd laugh at the guards down there, trying to get them down off that walkway around it. But they were up there one day. John Wingo was warden, and Stoney Parker was the guard. And one of them decided that it'd be great fun if they mooned the prison guards down below. Stoney said that was too much for me. I went in, I told the warden, I said, I can get them off that water tower. And he said, how's that? He said, I'll sprinkle them a little buckshot. It'll just sting them a little bit. And that's what he did. And they couldn't get down off there fast enough. But I knew Stoney Parker. He told me these stories. Dallas Gray was an old friend of mine. Dallas was one of the guards that Earl Tongue got locked up in Fort Sale House the night that Roscoe Gum was murdered. He was there. He told me about it. Roscoe Gum's nephew, Tater Mattingly, went to church with him, died just a few years ago, was living at their house the night that Roscoe Gum got the call to come to prison and what was going on. Benny Penniger, the young man, he was a young man then, that the inmates captured down at Swanee in Lyon County when he came in off the second shift from Calvert City, and they were waiting for him in his truck and grabbed him, took him hostage, drove all over the state. Benny Penniger is a good friend of mine. And not only did he tell me this story numerous times, he read the book, he read the writing before it ever went in the book. One of the most interesting first-person stories I got was an old man who called me one day. His name was Muriel Trimble. He was from Muhlenberg County. Muriel then was about 80-something years old, and he said, I'd like to come down. He said, I was an inmate at that penitentiary when I was 16 years old, back during the Depression. He said, I'd sure love to come back down and see it. So I called the warden. I forgot who it was then, but said, this old man wants to come down. And of course, most of the wardens I have known, especially recent, and Randy especially, are very interested in the history of the penitentiary. Anytime that there's some history that we can discover, an old inmate that wants to come back and talk about it, let's listen to him. So Muriel came down there. He was an 80-something-year-old man, almost blind, and we walked the prison yard with him. And Muriel told some interesting story. He said he was there during the Depression when I think the population in Idaho got up to 1,600. Now it's 800 and something, Brandy? 1,600. There's a picture in my book of them putting cots up in the walkway in Fort Sale House. You see it. He told me some interesting stories. He said he was in there. He was a juvenile, 16 years old. I think they'd busted a window, broken a window up in Central City somewhere, and that's where he got sent. He said there were prisoners serving time with him who had committed crimes in order to get in prison so they could get free treatment for gonorrhea. Yeah. And I said, well, what crimes did they commit? He said, well, the most frequent one, this is hard to believe, but this is what Muriel Trimble told me. He said the most frequent crime they committed was voting twice. Now, can you imagine today, Randy, sitting out there in the yard with the likes of Joe Craig, Billy House, and those guys, and they bump you and say, what are you doing time for? And you say, voting twice? I don't know. I don't think it would garner much respect. But that's what he told me. But the thing that is in the book that's a fascinating story was he was there on that walk down below in Fort Sale, which is about one of the few cell houses that's still intact today. It looked pretty much like it was when it was built in 1910. He told me they were down there, and there was a water boy named Sissy was taking water around the cells, and he's up on the third floor. If you read the book, you read about this. One of the most ghastly murders. He said all of a sudden he heard Sissy scream, and his water bucket came down over the rail, landed down there amongst them. And he looked up, and there was Charles Smith standing in front of his cell with the head of his inmate, Clayton Trimble, waving it like that. He cut his inmate's head off. Muriel Trimble saw that, when he came back as an 80-year-old former inmate. Died not long after that. By the way, Charles Smith was the only inmate ever executed at the penitentiary for killing another inmate. So, as I said, I've known every warden over the last 50 years. So yeah, it's firsthand knowledge. I have not fabricated anything in this book. Even down to the weather. Now, talking about the weather, that's easy to find. You go to the newspaper. They do a great job at these libraries. You want to know what the weather was like on June 15, 1926, you go look it up. It's got the temperatures up there, snow predicted and all that. There's only one name in the book that I changed. One name that I changed. And that was the name of the inmate who Sam Hooks shot in 1970 on the yard in July, I think it was, 1970, that had the guard around the neck with a knife, and he was getting ready to stab the guard, and Sam Hooks shot him at about 45 yards with AR-15 without a scope. I think it was an AR-15, I'm not sure. Really a dramatic time in the history. Shot him in the head and dropped him right there, killed him, and saved the guard's life. Well, needless to say, Sam Hooks, who was a distant relative of mine, was the patron saint of wall stand guards because it can get tedious up there. And it's a good example how up in this vast sea of monotony, a ship may come calling. And on that day, Sam Hooks was a heck of a shot. Always led the guards in shooting at the rifle range. Saved this man's life. Well, the family of Sam Hooks, whose widow, lives right next door to me today. Went to school with his daughter. Made an appointment with me one day. Came to see me. We hear you're going to tell the story about Daddy or Sam shooting the man in the penitentiary. I said, yes, so I'm going to include it in my book. And they asked me not to include it. I said, why not? I said, well, we're afraid of repercussions and all this in the family. And I thought, well, I don't know. I said, this story is important to correctional officers, and this book is important to correctional officers. It shows how there's so much heroism among them, and any day may call upon you to deliver. So I said, I don't know, I need to think about that. Well, one of the daughter's husband, Byron Jaces, worked at the penitentiary. He got me aside and said, Bill, you leave that story in there. Whatever you do, leave that story in there. Started reading the obituary of the victim of Sam Hooks' shooting, though, and I saw that he had a small son who had been about 2 years old at the time this happened, and he was a junior. And I thought, you know, that kid now is probably 25 or 30 years old. He was from Paducah. I said, he's probably still living in Paducah. And this comes out, and his name is in there, and it's going to be an embarrassment to him. And it doesn't lose anything. The story doesn't lose a thing. So I changed his name to what I really thought was the best name in the whole book, Rainbow Beamer. That sounds like somebody you walk in a yard, Rainbow Beamer. So Rainbow Beamer in the book is not really Rainbow Beamer, it's another name, but that's the only name that we changed. Of course, the executions always are dramatic affairs, and back in the days when they had the old dynamo, at one time when the prison first came online, the prison and the city of Edwards shared the same utilities, same power generators and water supply. So the old dynamo that they ribbed up for the nights of the execution that had to thrust that much voltage into the electric chair to execute somebody was the same one that serviced the city. So in fact, people always ask me this, you growing up over there, did the lights really dim the night that they executed somebody? And yes, they did. But that was before my time when they were on that particular system, and you'd have to stay up past midnight, sometimes 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning to see it. Been 165 inmates executed there. The last 2, and this book is already dated, the last 2 are not in the book, and they were by lethal injection. Instead of the old death house tacked on to 3-cell house, we now have an anesthetic death house out back where they have the lethal injection gurney and all of it set up. Randy White can speak to that, tell you every grisly detail about that. They even still have the electric chair, because there are still inmates on death row at Eddyville who were sentenced under the old law and technically would be entitled to be executed by electrocution, so we have to keep that around, although we keep that electric chair most of the time down in the museum that we have next to the penitentiary. I'd like to broadcast a little bit about, but I see my time's getting short. The most historic execution to take place at the penitentiary was not an execution, it was 7 executions. On the night of July 13th, Friday, July 13th, 1928, 7 men were executed the same night. It's hard to really fathom that until you think deeply about what that meant. These men had been on death row probably at that time, average time was probably 8 to 12 months. The keepers were the same ones day in, day out. These people get close. And all of a sudden you're called upon to kill 7 of these inmates who you know, and you know their families. 7 people were executed on that night, and then what happened? Those old guards went home, they worked the 3rd shift, they went home, got some sleep, and came right back the next night. Today, it's a complicated procedure where they have death squad to come in, they move them out at a certain time. Nobody actually knows who pushes the button for the lethal injection. I think there's 2 or 3 inmates. Ask Randy about that. He can give you all the details. Kelly Moss was executed in March of 1962. He was the last one executed until McQueen, just in the last 10, 12 years, who was the last one executed. Kelly Moss was from Henderson. There again, I write in the book about Kelly Moss, how violent he was, and he's really big and robust, and how he intimidated everybody, and he cursed and he screamed. He even fought with his mother the night they took him to death, and the warden thought they were going to have trouble getting old Kelly down there. He was a big guy. They thought they were going to have trouble getting Kelly in the chair. So he picked 2 of his biggest, strongest guards to take him, and one of them was R.P. Parker. Well, I knew R.P. Parker. The newspapers reported that old Kelly Moss, once they set him down in that chair, got religion. And once they pulled that leather bag over his head, he got remorse. Tears came rolling down his cheek and fell upon his chest. That's what the newspapers reported. But R.P. Parker told me a different story. And R.P. Parker was standing close to Kelly Moss as I'm standing to this podium right now. What had happened was they brought old Kelly in, cursing all the time, put him down in the chair. They shaved the spot on his head for the wet sponge. They put the saline solution to put the sponge on his head. They have an old football helmet. We got that down there. We get that back in the museum now. They put that football helmet on his head. It's got electrodes tied up to it. That night, they got too much water in the sponge. The water came running down his face. Dropped down on his chest. Now, R.P. Parker told me, he said the last words that Kelly Moss ever spoke was, "Where's that damn water coming from?" But the papers never printed it that way, so I knew that because R.P. Parker told me so. Well, the escapes from the penitentiary, fascinating. You can make a movie, I guess, about any of them. I mean, there's been guys that burrowed out under the wall. There was one, Eugene Jennings, he just climbed the wall. He would be a good rock climber today. He just, those old granite walls are uneven. He had ability to climb the wall. And as the fellow inmates would help him, they'd get a guard wall distracted, he'd just climb over it. He had Steve Martin, Jock Martin. I represented Jock in this case. There was always been rumors, I don't know if it still exists down there or not, but the inmates know that there's an old cave that goes up underneath that hill. And there was an old cave in Old Edel, covered up by Barker Lake, now the entrance to it. They always had this idea you could get down in that penitentiary and get into that cave and escape. And they said there's tunnels running underneath the ground here at the penitentiary, we can get into it, it leads to that cave. I mean, they got a lot of things not only to think, but also to imagine. Well, there are tunnels running underneath that penitentiary. They're steam tunnels. They were constructed for the massive steam pipes that went to the heating vents in these large cell blocks. And people could get into those things. Steve Martin got into them one time to his great chagrin. They went out looking for him. They couldn't find him. Steve was about that tall, and I think he's still in prison somewhere. He's about that tall. They called him Jock. He got in there. They looked all over for him. He was so small he could climb in underneath one of those pipes, and the guard almost stepping on his hand and didn't find him. After about 2 or 3 days and almost dead from dehydration, he stumbled out into an old broom closet in one of the cell blocks and fell over and passed out. They revived him, took him, treated him, and they charged him with escape. At that time, you could be charged with escape by just not being in an authorized area of the penitentiary. So we went to trial. I defended him. And there weren't not many defenses to escape. You'd have an inmate come in and say, I'm going to plead guilty. He's been out of the penitentiary for 2 years. What's your defense? I mean, you don't have any defense. He just wants a year out of the prison, a little windshield therapy, come over, see the pretty girls, go to a jury trial. What's he get? 1 to 5 years? What's that to him? He's doing 3 lives and 50 right now. And it all has to run with concurrent, so he has nothing to lose. But Steve, we put his defense on, we told all this stuff, and it really wasn't a defense. It really wasn't a defense. Jury found him not guilty. Only thing I could figure, they felt sorry. I thought, well, 3 days in that steam tunnel, 3 days in a steam bath, almost died. He's been punished enough. So I think, the most clever escape from there, though, not necessarily the most strenuous, but the most clever was back in the 1920s. They had a leather shop in there, and they manufactured leather goods for to be sold on the open market. Certain private industry would have a contract with corrections, and they'd have inmate labor, and they'd make these leather goods, and they'd package them up in these big boxes. They'd take them down to the front of the prison. They'd take them either on a truck over to the depot and ship them out. Well, one of the inmates who was working back in that factory talked a couple of his buddies in to putting him one of the boxes. They put him one of the boxes, and they taped him in, or whatever they used to secure the boxes, had it all wrapped up, shipped him out, and never heard from him again. They never caught him. No one knows what happened to him, but I can't imagine what kind of experience that guy could tell you. How'd you like to be shipped by the U.S. mail for who knows how long when he was able to get out? Or how'd you like to open that box when you were some hardware store thinking you're getting harnesses for horses, and you open it up and a human being jumps out? Anyway, the escapes they're fascinating, and you have to have a little admiration for some of the escape artists. All of them are security risks. You can't turn your back on any of them. The ones that are security risks, I think Randy will vouch for, will be your best inmates. They're looking. They won't bother you with a lot of. They're looking for a good opportunity. And Don Tate was a security risk, and when he went out in the way that he did. The centerpiece of the story, of course, centers around Tex Walters and the 1923 shootout. When Tex Walters, W.B. Griffith, and another inmate got a gun that had been smuggled in through Lillian Walters, who was Tex Walters' wife, through assistance from some inmates. He ended up killing 3 prison guards, including my grandfather's first cousin, Hodge Cunningham, who managed to get back to the annex and shut the gate before they were able to get there. They went to the mess hall. They got up in the top floor, and they barricaded themselves in, and they were there for 3 days. The National Guard was called in, and it was a standoff called the standoff at Eddyville. Got national news headlines all over the United States. Great, an amazing story. Tex Walters, interesting, charismatic individual. I don't have time to tell you all about him, but he was married to Lillian Walters. And I read about this in the newspaper, and I have 2 sources of information on them. My dad was an 18-year-old laborer working on the lock and dam, constructing the lock and dam right in front of the prison. He said some days they'd have to quit work for bullets flying over their head from the National Guard and all the exchange of gunfire. Grace Litchfield, a longtime friend of mine, with a little girl, and she attended the trial. They tried Lillian Walters 3 times. Each of the inmates who were murdered. Lyon County jurors, all male, 3 not guilties. She used her beauty and her wiles. Great dresser, good-looking woman. Grace Litchfield told me about all the young girls wanted to come to trial because they wanted to see Lillian Walters. She was actually from Newcastle, Indiana. And I'll finish this up by giving a little of a follow-up story. Lillian Walters, if you read the book, you'll know that she was really the centerpiece of that story. Movie could be made. By the way, they came there to make a movie several years ago called The Last Dance. Dennis Quaid, Sharon Stone, y'all may have read about it. He had a lot of extras up there. Warden was Phil Parker. He said, I want you to sign your book for these movie stars, Sharon Stone, Dennis Quaid. I said, okay. So I put this book down there, and I signed the Sharon Stone. I signed the Dennis Quaid, 2 or 3 more stars, knowing they'd probably get pitched somewhere along the way, so didn't think any more about it. They came in and made the part of the movie there. It's a terrible movie, by the way. You ever seen The Last Dance with Sharon Stone? Terrible. But they did make some of it there. I don't know whether Sharon actually came or not. You know, they make those movies, and sometimes the actors and actresses don't have to be never seen. But I got a call one day at home, and this man said, Judge Cunningham, this is so-and-so. I'm the secretary for Sharon Stone. Well, I think it's somebody pulling a joke on me. You know how we are. And I'm listening to him. I said, okay. And I kind of don't want to show my hand too much. He said, I just called and tell you that Ms. Stone wants to tell you how much she enjoyed your book. I said, oh, okay. Still trying to detect who this is. Can't detect the voice. And he continued to call, and I kept him going with the conversation. I asked him, did Sharon Stone actually come? I said, well, I'm surprised she read the book. He said, actually, she locked herself up in a cell on hours at a time to acclimate herself to this emotional and mental image and impression and feeling of being an inmate. He said, you read your book while she was locked up in that cell. After a while, and this is something I picked up in the service. If you ever served in the service overseas, you begin to detect accents pretty good. I noticed that this guy had no accent. I don't know how it is now, but the people that don't have accents when I was in the service, Randy, were people from California. And sure enough, he was the real McCoy. Anyway, I've always thought that the movie would be a great movie of Lillian Walters and the story about her. But anyway, I thought one day, Lillian Walters, this is before I finished the book and was getting ready to put the final touches on it, she'd be 92 years old. She could theoretically still be alive. So I had a good friend, Norman Curry, judge up in Columbus. Is it Columbus or Columbia, Indiana? Columbus, right? Who I'd been a seatmate with out at the Judicial College in Reno, Nevada. Called Norman up. I said, this girl was from Newcastle, Indiana. Her father's name was Louis Manger. All this information was in the news accounts. He was head of the Salvation Army at Newcastle. Who you know in Newcastle that might be able to track this down? I got just the guy, he said. Tom Saunders, PVA. He's a young historian. He's an ambitious politician. He knows everybody in the county. So I called Tom. And Tom called me back in a few days. He said, I found your girl. He'd found Lillian Walters. Out of a promise to her, I won't tell you what her real name is now, but she was a Manger. I went up there. I said, I got to come. He said, she says she doesn't want to talk to you about it. Can't imagine, can you? I mean, she was tried 3 times in my court. She's had me years before for murder. She didn't want to talk to the judge that's now sitting on that court. But I go up there. I'm going to make a long story short. My time's running out. So I had dinner with Tom, who's now in the state legislature up there, by the way. So the next morning, I thought, I don't know what I'm getting into. I went and got me some flowers, plastered my hair down like I was going to go on my first date. Knocked on the door, She comes to the door, tall, straight, erect, at 92, still a very attractive woman. And I opened the door, and I started telling her who I was. She stepped back and had her daughter come out because she thought I was a salesman. Her mother came, I told her who I was. I had sent a transcript ahead for Tom to take out there, so she knew who I was. And the sister said, Mom, this is Judge Cunningham, the one who wrote the book. And Lillian said, no book. We're not having any book. I said, that's fine. Let's just get acquainted. So I went in, sat down, talked to her, and we started talking. Slowly but surely, she began to open up and talked about things, talked about Tex, told me where he's from, things of this nature. And it's probably the most amusing thing. There was rumored around that she beguiled all the men jurors in those 3 trials to get a wrangle a not guilty verdict. And even Judge Bush, old Judge Bush, may have had a crush on her. The last time she was tried and found not guilty, all the male jurors, they filed out of the jury box and gave her money to pay her way back to Newcastle. And she talked about, she worked out here at the Freedman Center in a settlement house and went on a train to see Tex every weekend. Anyway, she said, oh, yes, Judge Bush. He was such a nice old man. So I went out and we had a picture taken with her. There's Lillian and me standing out there in the front yard, picture taken, and I got that picture at home somewhere. I thought, that's kind of ironic. Here is a murder defendant that was indicted in my court 70 years ago, and the circuit judge in my court today drives 225 miles up to see her to have his picture taken with her. Maybe, Paula, when we can't find that picture, I may have thrown it away. Anyway, time's running out. It's been fun talking about this. I'll be willing to stay around after we sign off here tonight. What do you take away from the book? I always think you have to have something to take away. I want to take something away from a book I read. I want to learn something from it. I want to get a new idea. So what do you take away from this book when you're through? I don't know. Hopefully you take away what I took away from the castle and still have abiding in me from the castle. There is in the beginning this quote that probably doesn't mean much to you. There is a castle on a hill. In my dreams it comes and goes, light and dark, dark and light. What it means I do not know. What it means is there's light in darkness and there's darkness in light. In that prison, in the 126-year history of that prison, there's heroism. There's people and circumstances that have elevated people to unbelievable human heights of heroism and nobility. There's also evil. Many things in this book tells you about unspeakable evils that inmates have inflicted on each other and on prison guards and personnel. You have light, you have dark. And even among the inmates that are dark, there's a certain amount of light. And even though there's a certain amount of light, there's also a certain amount of darkness. That idea struck me when we were going out of the penitentiary with my cousin, Mitch Cunningham. We made the tour of the penitentiary. He was 80 years old, walking down, and he had his picture taken in front of that monument in front that has his father's name on it. And we were standing there. It was a cold, sunny winter day. But as we were standing there, I noticed the shadow passed over. The cloud passed over, and they were in a shadow, but down the street, the sun was still shining. And it shifted around, and the light passed, the darkness passed here. It all came kind of poetically together. There's darkness and light, and there's light and darkness. It's all part of that human experience. Jekyll and Hyde gives us all a better understanding of human nature and our people who are incarcerated. We've got a couple of items up here. William Woolham, an inmate I was going to tell you a little more about, but I ran out of time. This is his gun he made out of soap. Randy's going to be standing by to answer questions. I'm going to be signing off. Thanks for watching.